When a narcissist betrays a super empath, what they lose is not simply a person, it's an entire psychological ecosystem that was quietly sustaining them. This is often misunderstood because, on the surface, the narcissist appears self-sufficient, even dominant. But beneath that exterior lies a profound dependency not on love in its mature form, but on what we might call emotional supply. And the super empath, almost paradoxically, becomes the most potent source of that supply. A super empath doesn't just give attention, they offer attunement. They sense, absorb, and respond to emotional undercurrents with remarkable precision. In many cases, they overextend themselves, not out of weakness, but because their identity has been shaped around connection, repair, and meaning. To the narcissist, this feels like a perfect arrangement. There is admiration without immediate consequence, forgiveness without clear limits, and emotional availability that seems endless. But this dynamic contains a quiet tension. The more the empath gives, the less the narcissist develops the internal capacity to regulate themselves. Over time, the narcissist becomes increasingly reliant on external validation to maintain their sense of self. What looks like confidence is often compensation. What looks like control is often avoidance. So, when betrayal occurs, and it often does, because the narcissistic pattern tends toward entitlement and boundary violation, it creates a rupture that is fundamentally different from ordinary relationship breakdowns. The super empath, once they reach their threshold, doesn't simply react, they recalibrate. And when they withdraw, they do so with a clarity that can feel almost surgical. This is the moment the narcissist is unprepared for, because the supply they were receiving was not interchangeable. It wasn't just attention, it was deeply personalized emotional resonance. The empath had learned their patterns, anticipated their needs, and filled in their emotional gaps. When that disappears, the narcissist is left facing something they've spent a lifetime avoiding, an internal emptiness they don't know how to soothe. And here's where the deeper psychological reality emerges. The narcissist is not just losing a relationship, they are losing a regulatory system. Without the empath's presence, their unresolved insecurities, their fragile self-concept, and their underlying shame begin to surface. But instead of processing these experiences, the typical response is to seek replacement in another source of validation. Another person to stabilize what feels unstable within. Yet this is where the fracture becomes more permanent, because what they lost was not generic. A super empath, by nature, is rare not because they are perfect, but because of their capacity to endure, reflect, and connect at depth. And once that connection is broken through betrayal, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to recreate. So the narcissist moves forward, often appearing unchanged, sometimes even seeming to thrive. But internally, something has shifted. The absence of that specific emotional supply creates a kind of psychological deficit. There is more restlessness, more dissatisfaction, more subtle frustration that cannot easily be named. They may accumulate new relationships, new sources of attention, but the quality is different. It lacks the depth that once quietly sustained them. And what we begin to see is that the inability to recover is not about punishment or consequence imposed from the outside. It is the natural result of a structure that cannot repair itself once its most stabilizing element is removed. Without that external reflection, the narcissist is left with themselves, and that is precisely the place they have never learned to inhabit. In the end, the loss is not just of a person, but of the illusion that they never needed one. What makes this dynamic even more psychologically charged is the role of perception, specifically the way a super empath sees. Because unlike others who may engage at a surface level, a super empath tends to perceive beneath behavior. They are not only responding to what is said or done, but to what is implied, what is avoided, what is defended against. Over time, they begin to form a remarkably accurate picture of the other person's inner world. Now, in a healthy relationship, being deeply seen can be healing. It allows for integration, for growth, for the gradual softening of defenses. But for someone organized around narcissistic patterns, being seen carries a very different weight, because what is being protected is not just an image, it is a fragile, often unacknowledged sense of inadequacy or shame that cannot easily be tolerated. So when a super empath reflects back what they perceive, they are not doing so to expose or to shame. In fact, quite often, they attempt to communicate with care, with patience, even with a desire to help the other person become more self-aware. But the impact of that reflection is not received in the way it is intended. Instead, It is experienced as a threat, and this is where the metaphor of the mirror becomes important. The super empath, in many ways, becomes a psychological mirror, one that does not distort, one that does not flatter unnecessarily, but one that reveals. And what is revealed is not always comfortable. It includes inconsistencies, contradictions, emotional avoidance, and at times, a lack of genuine empathy. For the narcissist, this kind of mirroring is deeply destabilizing, because their sense of self relies on maintaining a certain narrative, one in which they are justified, superior, or at the very least, not at fault. When that narrative is challenged, especially by someone who has been close enough to observe them intimately, it creates a kind of internal dissonance that is difficult to resolve. Now, there are generally two ways a person can respond to this kind of dissonance. One is through reflection, by becoming curious, by asking, is there truth in what I'm being shown? The other is through Arabic dal, Arabic fa, Arabic aleph, Arabic aleph, Arabic aleph, Arabic tain, through denial, projection, or even devaluation of the person holding the mirror. And more often than not, the narcissistic response leans toward the latter. So the empath, who initially functioned as a source of validation, gradually becomes reinterpreted as a source of discomfort. Their insights are dismissed, their intentions are questioned, and in some cases they themselves are blamed for the very issues they are trying to address. This is not accidental. It is a defensive maneuver designed to protect the existing self-structure from collapse. But something important happens once betrayal enters the picture, because at that point the empath's perception sharpens. The tolerance that once allowed them to overlook certain patterns begins to dissolve, and what remains is a much clearer, more grounded recognition of reality. They are no longer negotiating with what they hope the person could be. They are seeing what is, and when they walk away from that position of clarity, the mirror doesn't disappear, it lingers psychologically. The narcissist may attempt to move on, to find new relationships, new environments, new sources of affirmation, but the experience of having been fully seen cannot be undone. It introduces a kind of awareness that is difficult to completely repress. This is part of why recovery becomes so complicated. Because to truly move forward, the narcissist would have to engage with that reflection not superficially, but honestly. They would need to confront aspects of themselves that have long been defended against. And without a developed capacity for self-reflection, this becomes an overwhelming task. So instead, the pattern often repeats. New mirrors are sought, but only those that reflect a more acceptable image. Depth is avoided. Authentic feedback is filtered out. And yet, the absence of genuine reflection leads to stagnation rather than growth. In the end, what the narcissist cannot escape is not the other person's judgment, but their own unexamined reality. If we look at this through the lens of attachment, the picture becomes even more revealing, because what we are really observing is not just behavior in the present moment, but patterns that were formed much earlier, patterns that shaped how a person relates to closeness, vulnerability, and emotional dependence. Many individuals with narcissistic tendencies are operating from what we would call an avoidant, or, in some cases, a disorganized attachment style. This doesn't mean they don't crave connection. In fact, quite the opposite. The desire for closeness is there, but it exists alongside a deep discomfort with true intimacy. So what develops is a kind of contradiction. They seek connection, but they structure it in a way that allows them to remain in control. Control, in this sense, becomes a substitute for safety. If they can dictate the terms of the relationship, when to engage, when to withdraw, how much of themselves to reveal, then they can avoid the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. And for a time, this works, particularly when paired with someone who is highly accommodating, highly understanding, and willing to adjust themselves to maintain the bond. This is where the super empath enters the dynamic in a very specific way. Their natural inclination is to move toward connection, to repair, to understand. They are often more tolerant of inconsistency, more willing to give the benefit of the doubt, more patient in the face of emotional distance. And so, without necessarily intending to, they help stabilize the narcissist's attachment system. They absorb the fluctuations. They create continuity where there might otherwise be rupture. But this balance is fragile, because it depends on one person overfunctioning while the other remains underdeveloped in their capacity for emotional regulation. And eventually that imbalance reaches a limit. When betrayal occurs, it disrupts not only the relationship, but the entire attachment structure that has been holding it together. The super empath, who once moved toward the narcissist, now moves away not impulsively, but with a kind of grounded certainty. And this shift is profoundly disorienting for someone who has relied on maintaining distance as a form of control. What happens next is something we might describe as an attachment collapse. The strategies that once provided a sense of stability, detachment, emotional minimization, intermittent engagement no longer work in the same way, because the other person is no longer participating in the pattern. The usual push-pull dynamic is interrupted, and in that interruption, something deeper begins to surface. The very vulnerability that was being avoided, the fear of abandonment, the fear of not being enough, the fear of emotional exposure starts to come into awareness. But without the internal tools to process these feelings, they are experienced not as something to be understood, but as something to escape. So the response often takes one of two forms. Either there is an attempt to reassert control to pull the other person back in, to reestablish the old dynamic, or there is a rapid shift toward finding someone new who can take on the same role. But in both cases, the underlying issue remains unresolved. What is important to understand is that this is not simply a matter of unwillingness. It is, in many cases, a matter of capacity. The ability to sit with emotional discomfort, to reflect on one's own patterns, to understand oneself, to grow, to change, to heal, to tolerate the ambiguity and vulnerability that come with genuine connection. These are capacities that must be developed over time. And if they were not supported early on, they do not spontaneously appear in moments of crisis. So when we say that the narcissist cannot recover easily after losing a super empath, what we are really pointing to is a kind of internal disorganization. The external system that helped regulate their emotional world is no longer available, and the internal system is not sufficiently developed to take its place. And this leaves them in a difficult position. Because what they are facing is not just the loss of a relationship, but the loss of a structure that allowed them to avoid themselves. In the end, the greatest instability is not in being left, it is in having no inner ground to stand on when it happens. And this brings us to a conclusion that is often resisted, both by the person who has been lost and by the one who did the losing, that not all connections are replaceable. In a culture that emphasizes abundance and choice, we tend to assume that if something ends, something equivalent can be found. But psychologically, that is not always how human relationships work. Because what a super empath offers is not simply presence or attention. It is a particular quality of engagement, a depth of listening, a willingness to understand, and a capacity to remain emotionally available even under strain. This is not common. It is shaped by a combination of temperament, life experience, and often an early adaptation to environments where emotional attunement was inconsistent. In other words, the very traits that make a super empath so giving are also the result of their own history. When a narcissist forms a bond with someone like this, they are not just entering a relationship, they are entering a dynamic where much of their emotional functioning is being supported externally. The empath compensates for what is underdeveloped. They smooth over ruptures, interpret silences, absorb projections, and continue to engage even when the exchange is uneven. But once that bond is broken, particularly through betrayal, the assumption that this dynamic can simply be recreated elsewhere begins to fall apart. The narcissist may seek out new relationships quickly, sometimes with a sense of urgency. And on the surface, it may appear that they have moved on without difficulty. There may be charm, intensity, even a repetition of the same patterns that initially created the connection. Yet over time, a subtle dissatisfaction tends to emerge, because what is being encountered is not the same depth of attunement. The new person may offer attention, but not the same level of insight. They may provide validation, but not the same emotional resilience. And importantly, they may not tolerate the same degree of imbalance. This is where the difference becomes evident. A super empath does not simply engage, they endure. They stay in conversations that are uncomfortable. They seek understanding where others might withdraw. And they hold space for complexity in a way that is both rare and, at times, unsustainable for them. When that presence is removed, what remains is a series of interactions that feel comparatively shallow, even if they are more stable on the surface. For the narcissist, this creates a kind of internal contradiction. There is a desire for the ease and admiration that new relationships can provide, but there is also a lingering sense that something is missing. And because that missing element is not easily named, it often leads to a cycle of seeking new people, new experiences, new sources of stimulation without ever fully addressing the underlying absence. It is important to understand that this is not about idealizing the super empath or suggesting that they are without limits. In fact, their tendency to overgive is often part of what makes the dynamic unsustainable. But it does mean recognizing that certain relational qualities, depth, patience, emotional intelligence, cannot be mass-produced. They are developed over time, and they are offered selectively. So when that kind of connection is lost, it leaves an imprint, not always consciously acknowledged, not always openly grieved, but present nonetheless. And without the capacity for self-reflection, that imprint becomes a source of quiet frustration rather than growth. The tragedy, in a sense, is that the very person who could have facilitated deeper awareness is the one who is pushed away through the act of betrayal. And what follows is not freedom, but repetition of different faces, similar patterns, and a persistent sense that something essential remains out of reach. In the end, what cannot be replaced is not the person alone, but the depth of connection they made possible, and without that depth, nothing else quite satisfies.